For 12 years, a killer walked past the same coffee shops, ate at the same restaurants, sat in traffic on the same highway as the people hunting him. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was an architect, a husband, a father. And the thing that finally caught him wasn't a confession or a tip or a lucky break. It was a piece of pizza crust thrown in a trash can on a Manhattan sidewalk.
Long Island's South Shore doesn't look like a crime scene. It looks like a postcard. Dune grass, empty beach roads, the kind of quiet you drive 2 hours from the city to find. Ocean Parkway cuts straight through that quiet, a thin ribbon of asphalt with marsh on one side and ocean on the other. For most people, it's a way to get to the beach. For one man, it became something else entirely. Starting in the early 1990s and continuing for nearly 2 decades, women began vanishing from Long Island. Not all at once, not in a pattern anyone noticed, not yet. One here, years pass, another there. Sandra Castilla disappeared in November of 1993. She was 28 years old, a New Yorker by way of Trinidad and Tobago. Her remains were found by hunters in a wooded area of Southampton. Karen Vergata vanished on Valentine's Day, 1996. She was 34. Part of her remains turned up on Fire Island later that year, but not all of her. Not yet. In 2000, a hunter's dog found the remains of Valerie Mack in a wooded stretch of Manorville.
She was 24. In 2003, more remains surfaced in that same Manorville woodline. They would eventually be identified as Jessica Taylor, 20 years old. 4 women, 4 separate discoveries, years apart, in different towns, under different circumstances. Nothing on paper connected them. But there was a pattern investigators simply couldn't see yet, because the last piece hadn't arrived. And when it did, it would arrive all at once. Between 2007 and 2010, 4 more women went missing. Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello. All of them worked as escorts, advertising online. All of them were in their 20s. All of them vanished after arranging to meet a client. And all of them were about to be found, together, in a way that would turn a string of quiet disappearances into one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in American history. On May 1st, 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shannon Gilbert disappeared after visiting a client in the beachfront community of Oak Beach. Before she vanished, she made a frantic 911 call. She told the dispatcher someone was after her. Her mother refused to let the case go quiet. She pushed, she called, she demanded a real search. And in December of 2010, while combing the brush along Ocean Parkway looking for Shannon Gilbert, police found something they weren't looking for. On December 11th, they found the remains of Melissa Barthelemy. 2 days later, on December 13th, they found 3 more sets of remains within a half-mile stretch. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Costello, and Megan Waterman. 4 women, wrapped in camouflage-patterned burlap, left within walking distance of each other. Investigators would come to call them the Gilgo Four. And once they started looking seriously at that stretch of parkway, they couldn't stop finding bodies. In March of 2011, more remains surfaced. The skull and hands of Jessica Taylor, the same woman found partially in Manorville 8 years earlier. In April, Karen Vergata's skull turned up off Ocean Parkway on the Nassau County side. The same Karen Vergata who'd vanished in 1996. By the time the searching stopped, at least 10 sets of human remains had been recovered from this single stretch of Long Island coastline. Some had been there for years, some for decades. And Shannon Gilbert, the woman whose disappearance had started the whole search, her remains were found that December in a marsh near Oak Beach. Police ultimately ruled her death an accidental drowning, unconnected to the other killings.
Her family has never accepted that conclusion. They point to her 911 call, to the position her body was found in, and argue that the official story doesn't add up. In the spring of 2011, Suffolk County had a serial killer on its hands. 10 victims. No suspect. Detectives chased leads that led nowhere. A convicted killer named John Bittrolf, arrested in 2014 for 2 unrelated Long Island murders with a disturbingly similar victim profile, was investigated for years as a possible suspect. He was never charged in this case. Meanwhile, the department meant to be solving these murders was falling apart from the inside. In 2015, Suffolk County's own police chief, a man named James Burke, was arrested. Not for anything related to Gilgo Beach, but for beating a handcuffed suspect and then trying to cover it up. He was eventually sentenced to federal prison.
But Burke's name kept resurfacing in connection with this case anyway. An escort came forward claiming she'd had contact with him at parties near Oak Beach, the same community where Shanann Gilbert disappeared. No charges were ever filed connecting Burke to any of the killings. It remains to this day an allegation, not a finding. But it's part of why so many people, for so long, believed this case had been mishandled from the very beginning. Picture it. A task force under-resourced, a leadership scandal eating up headlines, and a killer who, as far as anyone knew, might have simply stopped. Or might still be out there. The case sat, unsolved, through most of the 2010s. Families waited. Detectives rotated through 5 different police commissioners. 3 different district attorneys took office and left without an arrest. And then, in 2022, something changed.
If you're finding this case as unsettling as we do, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Back to the case. In 2022, a new district attorney, Ray Tierney, took office in Suffolk County, and he did something that sounds almost too simple to matter. He put together a dedicated task force and told them to start from page 1. Read every file again, every witness statement, every piece of evidence sitting in an evidence locker for a decade or more. Buried in the original case files was a detail from one of the surviving witnesses, a roommate of one of the victims, who described a client as ogre-like, big, intimidating. He drove a specific kind of vehicle, a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck. Investigators also had something else from the original investigation: cell phone records. Burner phones had been used to arrange meetings with several of the victims before they disappeared, and those burner phones had pinged off cell towers in a tight cluster of blocks in a town called Massapequa Park. An unusual physical description, a specific vehicle, a narrow geographic window. Put those 3 things together, and for the first time in over a decade, investigators had something to actually chase. They landed on a name: Rex Heuermann, a licensed architect,
A married father of 2, a man who ran a consulting firm in Manhattan and lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Massapequa Park, practically in the center of that cell tower cluster. Nobody who knew him would have looked twice at him. That's not a detail I'm adding for effect. That's the pattern in nearly every account from people who crossed paths with him. Co-workers, neighbors. He didn't stand out. He wasn't supposed to. But investigators started watching him, quietly, patiently. And in July of 2022, they collected something from his trash, 11 discarded water bottles, and sent them for DNA testing. They were looking for a match to something they'd been holding on to since 2010. Hair, recovered from the remains of the Gilgo 4, too degraded at the time for the DNA technology that existed back then. But technology moves forward, and by 2022, whole genome DNA sequencing could do things mitochondrial testing from a decade earlier simply couldn't. The results from those water bottles wouldn't be enough on their own,
but they pointed investigators in exactly the direction they needed to go.
On January 26, 2023, detectives were tailing Rex Heuermann in Manhattan. He ate lunch, he finished a pizza, and he threw the box, crust and all, into a public trash can. That's it. That's the moment. No dramatic chase, no confrontation, just a man discarding his own garbage, with no idea that the crust in that box was about to end everything. Detectives recovered it. They sent it to the same forensic lab that had been working the water bottle samples. On June 12, 2023, the lab delivered its results. The mitochondrial DNA from that pizza crust matched male hair recovered from the remains of Megan Waterman, one of the Gilgo Four. Prosecutors would later say the match excluded 99.96% of the North American population as possible alternatives. In plain terms, this wasn't a coincidence. This was him. And once investigators had that thread, they started pulling. Hair found on other victims was tested against Heuermann's DNA profile, and against his wife's and his daughter's. Some of it matched the women in his own family, not because they were present at any crime. Investigators believe the hair simply transferred from his clothing, in his own home, onto laundry, onto surfaces, ordinary domestic transfer that had, without either woman knowing it, been sitting in an evidence file for over a decade. Neither his wife nor his daughter has ever been charged with anything. By the time the picture came together, the vehicle, the phone records, the hair, the DNA, investigators weren't chasing a theory anymore. They had their man. On July 13th, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested. He was charged with 3 counts of murder: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. The next day, July 14th, he stood in a courtroom and pleaded not guilty. The judge ordered him held without bail. Within weeks, he was also charged in connection with the 4th Gilgo 4 victim, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, completing the set of murders that had first drawn investigators to this stretch of Parkway back in 2010. In December of 2023, he was charged with the murder of Valerie Mack, the woman whose remains had first surfaced in Manorville back in 2000, 23 years earlier. In 2024, charges followed for Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castilla. 7 counts of murder in total. Women whose deaths spanned 3 decades. Women who, until this moment, had only ever been known to the public as numbers. Jane Does, case files, a body found near a highway.
They finally had a name attached to their deaths. It just wasn't the name anyone expected. A case built this heavily on DNA evidence doesn't just sail into a courtroom. It gets challenged, hard. Heuermann's defense team went after the whole genome DNA testing method directly, arguing the lab that performed it wasn't properly licensed in New York to conduct that specific kind of testing under state public health law. His attorney publicly dismissed the process as, in his words, close to magic. He argued that DNA can transfer between people and objects in ways that don't prove contact, let alone guilt. It was a real legal fight, not a stalling tactic. It went all the way to a judge's ruling. In September of 2025, the court ruled the DNA evidence admissible. It was described as the first time this specific whole genome testing method had been allowed into a New York criminal trial. A legal first, built entirely around a case that had waited over a decade to happen. By early 2026, prosecutors had also introduced the phone evidence, the burner phones, the cell tower data connecting them to Heuermann's home and office. He had originally been set to face trial in September of 2026. 7 murder counts, spanning 3 decades, about to be laid out in front of a jury. On April 8th, 2026, he did exactly that, pleading guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder. 7 women,
7 admissions. And then he did something almost nobody expected. As part of the plea agreement, he admitted to an 8th killing, Karen Vergata, the woman whose remains had first surfaced on Fire Island back in 1996, and whose skull wasn't recovered off Ocean Parkway until 2011. He was never formally charged with her murder. He simply admitted to it. 8 women, some of whom had waited 3 decades for someone to say their name in connection to what had happened to them. On June 17, 2026, Rex Heuermann stood before Judge Timothy Mazzei for sentencing.
The judge did not hold back. He told Heuermann he assumed he was a little bit sorry for the 8 women he strangled. 8 that we know of, he added, before calling him directly a coward. Heuermann was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, after decades of waiting, after a case that had gone cold for over 10 years, after false leads and a scandal-ridden police department and evidence that sat in storage until the technology caught up to it, the victims' families finally stood up and spoke. They called him cold-blooded. They told him in their own words what his 3 decades of silence had cost them. And when the sentence was read, the room erupted in applause. It's tempting, in a case like this, to let the story end with the killer, with the sentence, with the word closure. But closure isn't really the right word for what happened here. Not fully. What we should hold on to, at the end of all this, isn't the architect. It's the women. Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, Amberlynn Costello, Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, Sandra Costilla, Karen Vergata.
For years, some of them were known only as a case number, a Jane Doe, a set of remains in a wooded lot. They had names. They had families who never stopped looking for them, even when the case had gone cold and the world had moved on. 8 women, 30 years, and it took one thrown-away piece of trash to finally bring them justice. They deserve to be found a lot sooner than that. If this case affected you the way it affected me, consider subscribing. We cover cases like this every week, with the same care for the facts and the people at the center of them.